For each test, there will be some potential essay questions. There will be one essay question at the end, and I'll post, several different ones, and it will be one of those. And typically I go through the answers, even though, we did the lecture, but, it was a refresher, and maybe if you weren't there that day. So for the chapter 14 essay question is, what is stress? What causes stress? How does this affect the body? And what is the appraisal, and what is coping? If you go back through that PowerPoint, the way it's listed, it kind of hits the bullet points for all those things. It's like, if you can take those bullet points and expand a little bit on those, you should do fine on the essay question. Okay, so first of all, and so I did kind of take the bullet points and moved them over to this. The definition of stress. What is stress? A state of arousal that arises when we perceive that the demands of the situation it's going to threaten our ability to cope effectively. It could be, there's several different kinds. So there could be big ones like catastrophes, like a terrorist attack or 9/11. There can be major life events like, you're in a car wreck or you get divorced. Those are big stressors. They occur, though, infrequently. So we don't have big stressors or catastrophes we're facing all the time, even though some of us do catastrophize things. Typically, the worst stressors are these daily hassles / micro stressors, and they're stressors that we are just encountering day after day after day. Traffic, for example. Traffic, do you have enough money? Things like that, these daily hassles. And so those really wear you down compared to, again, catastrophes and major events. You don't encounter those too often. The GAS, the General Adaptation Syndrome, it's a great system for emergencies. It's not so great for microstressors. What you go through that alarm and resistance and exhaustion. The alarm that there's something there, resistance that you're kind of taking care of it, and then hopefully you take care of it and you stop. So if like a lion was chasing you, you would run away, and if you get away, then that's the end of that. You don't think about it anymore. But with daily hassles and those stressors, we go in that alarm and resistance, and then we just stay in that resistance phase, and it causes us to go into exhaustion. And that exhaustion can lead to negative health outcomes. Men are more likely to try to escape and shut down, not talk, get antisocial, maybe drink, things of this nature. And according to the textbook, there are gender differences, and that women are more likely to try to affiliate or maybe ruminate more. Again, with gender differences, there are differences, but those differences are usually smaller than what we perceive. So it's not two completely separate bell curves. It's like there's a lot of overlap between the biological sexes. So you got that GAS, some differences in men and women. I did post a little article if you want to look at that I was involved with a long time ago. What this article showed was that basically if you bring men and women into the lab and you tell them that you're going to shock them, kind of like not quite Milgram, but similar, we're going to shock you, are the differences in men and women in if they want to have it done in a group or as an individual. And what this shows is that women were more likely to try to affiliate. They wanted to do those shocks in a group instead of by themselves. So it kind of it provides some evidence for what we were talking about with the gender differences. Outcomes. So if you don't deal with these stressors, it can lead to an increase in stress hormones, cortisol, things of this nature. It can lead to increase in unhealthy behaviors, which can also lead to an increase in things like heart disease or a weakened immune system. And it can be worse maybe for type A's. Not necessarily all type A's, but type A's that specifically are also high in impatience and high in hostility. And it's like hostility is one of the driving forces behind these negative health outcomes in regards to stress. When a stressor comes in, you have to appraise it, and that appraisal is going to be completely subjective. Something that stresses you out might not stress me out. Something that stresses me out might not stress you out. So how bad is that stressor? Totally subjective experience. As we talked about several times during that chapter, some things are out of your control, and there's not much you can do about those things. And you may appraise it differently, though, and that causes you stress. But on those things you can't control, it's like they're going to work out how they work out. And so no amount of worrying about it is going to change that. It goes back to things like stoicism, ideas like that. If you have too many of these negative appraisals to stress, it can lead to, and we discussed this in class, learned helplessness. Related to that, we talked about Seligman and that experiment. And related to that is the depressive explanatory style, where everything's terrible. It's always going to be terrible. It's always your fault. So it's you, it's internal, it's stable, and it's also global. It affects everything in your life. So that's kind of the negative outcomes. Learned helplessness, this depressive explanatory style. More positive way to go about it, resiliency, optimism, self-efficacy we talked about. And so some people are more resilient and they have just better ways of appraising stress. And we discussed some of the attributes that those people have. They have commitment to what they're doing, they like challenges, and they feel like they are in control. They have that internal locus of control. Usually those people are also going to have more self-efficacy, meaning that they feel like they can get things done. Because again, if you have internal locus of control, you feel like you can control the outcome to certain events. And because of that, just kind of a relationship, a correlation between those people are generally more optimistic compared to people that believe in more of an external locus of control, that don't have, a decent levels of self-efficacy. You have the stressor come in, you have the appraisal, and then you have the way of coping with those stressors. We had a whole bunch of examples in the textbook and in the slides. There was many different ways that people cope with stressors, music, exercise, things like that. There are some specific types of dealing with stressors too: the problem focused, the emotion focused, and the proactive coping. With the problem focused, there's a problem and you're trying to solve it. And this can be beneficial if it's like, if you don't have good grades in the class, that's a problem. And maybe you should try to do things to rectify that, get a tutor, whatever it is, drop other activities that you're doing. But sometimes some of the problems are, some of the experiences that you have are not problems to be solved. Problem focus may not be the best, and it's also cognitively taxing to be always looking out for problems to solve. So emotion coping is also another way to go, and depending on what the stressor is, it could be the more appropriate way of coping to deal with your emotions. And then proactive, we discussed, it's things like to build a reservoir of resiliency before the stressors even come. So like people that do mindfulness meditation, they kind of have a reservoir, and so when stressors come in, they're able to just let some of those stressors wash over them. And then someone that's like doesn't practice those things and doesn't do a lot of proactive coping, every stressor feels like an attack. And so then you have to deal with it, and you go through that GAS system and all those different things. So that's the essay question for chapter 14. The potential essay question for chapter 2 is, how does the research process work in social psychology? It's basically everything that we talked about in chapter 2. We had a little flow chart of how this works. And so there's a theory. It's large. It encompasses a lot. It explains a lot of human behaviors, like we talked about terror management theory, for example. And so it explains a lot, the big overarching theory. What we do with research is we have a testable hypothesis that's based from that theory. So you have the theory, you create a hypothesis based off of that theory, and then you conduct your experiment. With your experiment, you're going to have an independent variable, manipulated independent variable. This is the variable that the researcher controls. And you're going to have the dependent variable, the thing that you are measuring. On those DVs, we are going to be moving from what they call the conceptual to operational definitions. The one we talked about in class quite a bit was aggression. So aggression's a really big thing. It encompasses a lot. There's like thousands of different ways to measure aggression. So it is a conceptual variable. Aggression, racism, love, things like that. And what we want to do is take a conceptual variable for our experiment and bring it down to an operational definition, a very narrowly defined and a very clear definition for what aggression is. As an example, hot sauce. If one group, you offend them in some way, and then you're like, okay, pour hot sauce on this person's food that they're going to have to eat. And what the research shows is that people will pour more hot sauce on if you've made them angry or whatever, offended them in some way. So the DV is going to be the measurement of how much hot sauce they poured on that food. Maybe it's in ounces. A great big idea, the conceptual variable, and we brought it all the way down to hot sauce in ounces. It's kind of neat the way you can take one of those big variables and bring it down to a very narrowly defined one. So our independent variable, again, it's the one we manipulate, the researcher manipulates. The DV is the one that we're going to measure. Construct validity, the idea that we want to make sure that we're measuring what we're supposed to measure. Is pouring hot sauce a good measurement of aggression? Maybe. But then sometimes maybe you're just measuring irritation. So irritation is not the quite same thing as aggression. Or if you're like, we're going to measure heart rate for aggression. It's like, well, sometimes, if you exercise, your heart rate goes up. That doesn't necessarily mean you're aggressive. And so that would not have great construct validity. So we're basically making sure that we're measuring what we're supposed to measure. On those measurements, there are issues with self-report, and we discussed many of them. People don't remember, people lie. They want to appear to look maybe better than they are. We could also do behaviors, and that's maybe sometimes better. Sometimes you can run into the same thing, though. If they know you're watching them, that's going to change people's behaviors too, and they're going to try to be better than they maybe actually are. So behaviors, observational studies, same type of thing. So behaviors, observations of you're observing them, same kind of thing. We could also do more advanced, like technological procedures to measure whatever DV we're trying to get at. So if we did some kind of brain imaging and then showed them images of aggression, and then we saw what parts of the brain lit up. When we do things like that, like with an fMRI, with technological procedures, what we're trying to do is get around some of the issues that we have with the self-reports and behaviors. The trade-off is, they're quite a bit more expensive. You have to have a grant, you have to have the machines or contacts. With the other ones, like a self-report measurement, you could do that right now if you wanted to. On those observationals, those are going to be correlational studies. So if you observe, descriptive studies as well. If you were to observe how many acts of aggression on a playground during a recess, that's descriptive. You're just describing a situation. There was 20 acts of aggression. If you then took those 20 acts of aggression and maybe you had with each individual kid, and then you looked at their grades, so you got grades and acts of aggression. If you put those together, it's still an observational study, and we're not manipulating anything, but it's a correlational study. And we're saying there's maybe a relationship between acts of aggression and maybe grades go down. For social psych, like the gold standard are the true experiments where we have an independent, manipulated independent variable, and then we have random assignment. Random assignment that you can be assigned to either group A or B. I don't pick which group you go in. You don't pick which group. And then group A, we're going to do something to that group that we're not going to do to group B. If you give them medication to group A and then group B, you give a placebo. Correlational studies, we cannot talk about causation. So we can't say that like aggressive acts on the playground causes grades to go down. Chances are there's going to be another driving factor behind both of those variables. So like not a great home life could lead to more aggressive kids, and also it could cause their grades to go down. Bad neighborhoods, things of this nature, social factors. But with the true experiment, we are saying our independent variable is causing a change in the dependent variable. That if we were going to measure anxiety after we gave them that drug, and we're going to hope that that anxiety goes down, that means that our independent variable, the drug that we gave them, caused anxiety to go down. And then in the other group, the placebo group, the anxiety would not go down. And so that's what we're trying to do. Again, the gold standard, the scientific method, social psych, we love this. Sometimes there's a little bit of a trade-off between internal and external validity. With internal validity, it's like, is your experiment true? Basically, it's like, did your independent variable actually cause the change in your dependent variable? Are your variables good? Do you have this good internal validity? Is it valid? There can be things that can cause issues with your internal validity. Like, for example, with that drug study, we got group A, we got group B. If you're the researcher and you're giving the pills to each participant and you know which one it is, so I know this is the anti-anxiety pill. So you're giving it to the participant. You're like, I know this is the placebo, and you give it to the participant. With you knowing if it's the drug or the placebo can affect the actual participant unknowingly. So you might not know you're actually doing anything, but you could cause some kind of a change just by knowing which condition they're in. So one way around that kind of a confound is what it is double blind. You would be just handing out the pills, but the person handing out the pills doesn't know, but then somebody behind the scenes knows which participant is getting, the pill or the placebo. Other confounds, like if you let them pick which group they go into, that's a terrible confound. If you don't have a good sample as far as how you pick your sample, like if I picked students off the first row for group A and then students off the back row for group B, that's terrible. Because there could be an inherent difference between those two groups of people. And so that would not be like a good random sample. That could be a confound. So problems with your sampling, problems with the assignment can cause you issues with your internal validity. And then external validity, it's like what you did in the lab, is it actually realistic outside of the lab? Does it generalize to other labs? If I run a study in Massachusetts and then I go back and I run that study in Oklahoma, will the results be basically the same? And, if my results from Massachusetts do have that external validity, then yes, they would work in Oklahoma. But, that's not always the case. And that's actually part of the scientific process. Something that happens in Massachusetts, not necessarily is going to happen in Oklahoma, and vice versa. So you got your hypothesis, you've got your independent variable, you got your dependent variable, you're going to do the random assignment, maybe the double blind, all that stuff. You got it all sorted. You have to do an IRB, the Institutional Review Board, and we talked about this in class. It started in the 70s, I believe it was 74, because of Milgram, because of Zimbardo, and especially because of the Tuskegee experiment that we briefly talked about. You do the IRB, and basically they are like a governing body to make sure that you're doing things ethically and it's above board. You can have deception in your experiments. You just have to make sure to debrief the participants afterwards. If maybe there's not a placebo, everybody's getting the same pill, but you tell them that some of them are going to get a placebo. That would be deception, and you would debrief them at the end. In that experiment where we were going to shock people, we didn't actually shock anybody. We just told them we were going to shock them, but then we never did. And at the end, we were like, hey, we were never going to shock you. We just were wanting to get your reactions to the idea that you might have to endure a shock. So the deception, can do it, but again, then you have to have a debrief. And a debrief's good, even if you don't have deception, just to tell them, this is what we were looking for in this study, and be on the lookout for our results. If you wanted to go above and beyond, you could talk a little bit more about some of the other things that we talked about, like the open science, the replication crisis, and I'll talk more about that replication crisis. I'll probably have an entire lecture just on that, the power posing and stuff. If you want to talk about those things, p-hacking, feel free. But as long as you get the majority of what I've talked about for, if it's for 14, if you just hit the main points and if you get most of it, you'll do fine. And same for 2. You might miss a little bit, but as long as you get most of it, I'm pretty good about giving people full credit. It's going to be quite a bit. So, maybe 500 words or so. So if you write 100 words, chances are you're not going to get all the information in there. The grammar it doesn't have to be perfect. I don't write well without some kind of spell check. I don't spell well. And so I understand if the grammar's maybe going to be a little bit off, if the spelling's a little bit off, that's fine. However, if you don't have like any capitalization, and you don't have any punctuation, and half the words are misspelled, that is a problem, and I will take off for that. But if it's just a few minor errors here and there, don't worry about that. So, okay. That's for Chapter 14 essay question, the Chapter 2 essay question, and I'll get back at some point soon with the Chapter 3 and the Chapter 4 essay question. Thank you very much for listening.